Okay, so hello everybody. My name is Sammy Riccio, and I am the Donor Engagement Coordinator for Hawkwatch International. And I want to welcome you to our event, Nature's Best Hope, How to Bring Birds to Your Backyard. So this presentation is going to run for about an hour, and then we have an additional 30 minutes at the end for question and answer. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to pop them into our chat. We are able to bring in outside guest speakers thanks to supporters like you, so thank you very much. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker, Doug Tallamy. Doug is the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 106 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for over 41 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. Doug has written many books on this topic, including Nature's Best Hope, a New York Times bestseller. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to you, Doug. Take it away.
All right, thanks. Thanks very much, Sammy. Yeah, I do call this nature's best hope. That certainly applies to birds. We'll even talk a little bit about hawks well, specifically. But I'm going to give you a spoiler. My idea of nature's best hope is that you are nature's best hope. And I'm going to spend most of the time telling you why I think you're nature's best hope. But before we do that, let's talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea of nature's best hope was. E.O. Wilson, of course, was a very famous professor at Harvard, extremely long career, productive career. He died the day after Christmas 2 years ago. But one thing that was consistent throughout his very long career was his love of biodiversity, his love of life on Earth. And he consistently wanted to save it. Not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to human survival. I mean, we need nature. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save nature, if we're going to save functioning ecosystems on planet Earth, we have to save them on at least half of the planet. Otherwise, they'll disappear everywhere. And that includes humans. It's a very bold statement. And he spent most of the science talking about, or most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were actually going to save life on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's a great idea. We'll just put half the Earth aside, and all those things that are disappearing and suffering can be in that half, and we'll be in the other half, and it'll be wonderful. Problem is, half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture, and we've got 8 billion people in the other half with all of our airports and roads and agriculture and detritus. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So a lot of people are wondering how we can actually realize E.O. Wilson's dream, and that's basically what I want to talk about tonight. I do think we can do that, but we need a new approach to conservation to do it. Before we talk about that approach, though, let's talk about what happened on the East Coast in 2019. We had a very large oak mast. Members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time, and this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through there, then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze. Finally, when the insect is out, it's a dangerous time because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface in about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, it converts itself to a pupa. And then surprisingly stays as a pupa in that underground chamber for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. And they take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in it, and that is how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Why don't they come out the next year the way most insects would? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they come out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after they leave the acorn, it leaves a hole, kind of like a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants. Tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they've left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn is falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move the colony. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, they move the entire colony into the new acorn in about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard there, make sure nobody else comes in. And this is where they'll stay for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? Well, that's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions that comprise the bulk of nature, largely interactions between animals and plants. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn, fly up to a mile from the parent tree. Then they turn around, bury that acorn in a loose piece of dirt. And the object is they're going to go back and get the acorn for food in the wintertime. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. Specialized interaction between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have facilia, that is the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very, very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees in this country, and over a third of them can only reproduce in the pollen of particular plants. You won't have Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead. I could talk all day, all week, all year about nature specialized relationships. The point I want to make today, though, is that these relationships, in fact, nature itself, is on the ropes today. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave most of the country as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states. It's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And those are typically mountaintops. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We have grazed it. That's 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. And of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves, and each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need, because it is that nature, it is functioning ecosystems that keep us alive on planet Earth. So you might wonder why we've done all that. I wonder why we've done all that, and I don't know, but I suspect we thought that our nest, planet Earth, was so large we could foul it forever, and there wouldn't be any consequences. Of course, we were wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. This is not a prediction. Those birds are already gone. About a third of our North American bird population already gone. This is a prediction. The UN says, well, we're probably going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years. And they said it 2 years ago. So now I guess it's the next 18 years. Makes a nice headline, but it is not an option, folks. These are the species that keep us alive. We have to make sure this does not come to pass. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment. That's upon all of our houses. Now that's not what this talk is about. This talk's about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if planet Earth lost insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our vertebrate animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, and our mammals, those food webs would collapse and those animals would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There's some good news here, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself. But we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, of course, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. And here are just a few of them, a few of the things that plants do that we depend on every day, like producing oxygen, like cleaning water, slowing its journey to the sea where it's too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, building their tissues out of the carbon, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground through their root systems. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the eons. And once it's in the soil, the carbon is extremely stable. It can stay there for thousands of years. Plants are building topsoil. They're holding it in place. They're preventing floods. They're dampening severe weather. They're converting sunlight into food. If we lost our plants, we'd have to eat sunlight, and that'll be a real IT challenge. What are animals doing for plants? Lots of things, but these are important ones: providing pest control services, pollinating nearly 90% of those flowering plants, dispersing plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because of those 8 billion people that are demanding more and more ecosystem services every day. And we do have parks, we do have preserves, they're doing the best they can, but it's not nearly good enough, which is why we are now in the 6th great extinction event that the planet has ever experienced. There is a solution, though, and that is to practice conservation outside of parks and preserves, on landscapes just like this. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups that have been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another place and doing the same thing. Not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we were capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live together. We cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. Well, what I want to argue this evening is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. And that means we need to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every day, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, let's go back to private property. Most of the land is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. 85.6% of the country east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. I'm going to use the word conservation. I'm not really using it correctly. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left out there, absolutely. And that has been our conservation model for the last century. But we have to go beyond that now. We have to restore the nature that we've already destroyed. That's a lot of it. That's a lot of it. So we're talking about restoration biology, restoration ecology. And before you tell me, well, there's no way you're going to put it back exactly the way it was at some point in the past. I know that. But we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions so that you have ecosystem function once again, even if it's not exactly what was on a particular space at some point in the past. But in order to do that, in order to reconstruct new ecosystems, we have to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally, so we have to start with the most powerful ones. And there's two groups we can't do without. One is the flowering plants and the pollinators that allow them to reproduce. They are capturing energy from the sun and turning it into simple sugars and carbohydrates, which is essentially the food that drives all animal life on the planet, almost all animal life on the planet. So plants are making the food. They're storing it mostly in their tissues, their leaves. Well, now you've got to get that food to the animals, or you don't have any animals. If you don't have any animals, you don't have a functioning ecosystem. Well, it turns out that most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat something else that ate plants, and that typically is an insect, and not just any insects. Caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs. And if we have failed food webs, we will have failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That is the chickadee that is at my feeder right now as I speak. Excuse me. But all the species of chickadees around the country are doing pretty much the same thing. Because they spend so much time at our feeders, we tend to think that's all they eat is seeds. But actually, only 50% of their diet is seeds, even in the wintertime. And even in the wintertime, they're eating, the other 50% is insects and spiders. And when it comes time to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they give up seeds and they switch to invertebrates. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. Excuse me. So, something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars. One of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. A thin wrapper is exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. And because caterpillars are soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? Caterpillars are nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible. And a lot of beetles have very sharp edges too. And finally, it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids, particularly for birds during the breeding season. And I mention carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate. And you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. We have to get them from plants. Only plants make carotenoids. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting the carotenoids from? Well, again, during the breeding season, from those prey items, they bring back to the nest. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among bird prey. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm, way over here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They are essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough? One or two a day enough? Well, let's go back to Carolina chickadees. A lot of data on Carolina chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of Carolina chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands. Depending on the number of chicks in the nest, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get the chicks in that nest to the point where they fledge, where they leave the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 21 days, but they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count that. And if you want caterpillars, so you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars to get one clutch of a bird that's a third of an ounce, 4 pennies worth of bird through to independence. If you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you've got to have all those caterpillars in your yard because they only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road. And that's a general rule. Most birds are foraging very close to the nest. And if we landscape in a way that does not include all of those insects, all of those caterpillars. That's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major drivers of the bird declines that we're measuring. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the North American bird species into 2 groups: terrestrial bird species, the species that require insects at some point in their life history, typically when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects. So things like crossbills and finches and doves can actually make a little milk out of seeds and rear their young on seeds. And look, the species that don't require insects didn't lose any numbers in the last 50 years. But the species that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This does not prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you take bird food away, you lose the birds. So we need to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked our landscapes to do one thing, and that is be pretty. Now we're going to ask them to do 2 things. They're going to be pretty and ecologically functional. And if they're not containing a bunch of caterpillars, they're not going to be ecologically functional. So the next question is, how do we get caterpillars into our landscapes? How do we add them? Well, you add caterpillars by adding the plants that support those caterpillars. Seems easy enough, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we're choosing for our landscapes, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all of the Asian ornamentals that we typically landscape with. You can have ginkgos, you can have eucalyptus, you can have burning bush, you can have camellias, all the things that we love in our yards, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds. That's called host plant specialization, and it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. Why is that? Well, plants have made them specialize. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic products, compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense. It keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But insects do eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants can only eat particular plant lineages for which they have specialized adaptations that allow them to circumvent all of those plant defenses. Specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. It takes a long period of evolutionary history associated with those plants, but once the insects develop those adaptations, they become locked into them. So if you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas, the monarch's not going to start to make a living on hostas. It can't do it. It's locked into eating milkweeds. So at that point, it has 2 choices: fly away and find milkweed someplace else if it can, or starve to death. It turns out that this is actually very simple. There are 3 kinds of plants: plants that contribute energy to local food webs, plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and plants that actively remove energy, detract it from local food webs. The best genus of plants across the country in terms of contributing energy is Quercus, is the oaks. They're contributing more energy than any other plant genus by far. Good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's a pretty plant, has a nice yellow fall color, but nothing eats a ginkgo. So it's not adding any energy to the local food web. And a great example of a detractor, particularly in the east here, would be Callery pear, Bradford pear, burning bush, porcelain berry. There's a whole bunch of them that we plant as ornamentals. They don't support insect herbivores, but they do escape and displace the native plants that do support those herbivores. So they're actively removing plants or energy from local ecosystems. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're going to restore ecosystems, we got to build the food webs that support them. And that's not going to happen unless you choose the right plants. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it works when you do choose the right plants, starting with what's happening at our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. So where my wife Cindy and I moved in the year 2000. We got a piece of land on a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots. It was a very old farm, farmed almost 300 years. And our job, then they mowed it for hay. So there's very little there. Our job was to restore the ecosystem on that 10 acres. Well, early on, I tried to get caterpillars to make a living at our house. And the first one I started with was the Canadian owlet. I had never seen a Canadian owlet. I chose it because I thought it was pretty. That's what a Canadian owlet looks like. That's what the adult looks like. Well, you're not going to get Canadian owlet to make a living on your property unless you add its host plant, meadow rue. We didn't have any meadow rue. I'm sure there was meadow rue here 300 years ago, but this was farmed to death for a long time. So no more meadow rue. Got some meadow rue seeds from someplace, planted them, and it grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little faith the Canadian owlets would be able to find my meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it for at least 2 months after I planted it. Then one day I was walking by for another reason, and I glanced over, and it was covered with Canadian owlets. They'd found it right away. I'm still surprised about that. But now we have a good population of meadow rue and a good population of Canadian owlets. So we've added 2 species to the local ecosystem. The restoration has begun. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway, this beautiful moth. Actually, that's a misnomer, has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. We didn't have any ditch daisy, but I did know where there was some in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, planted them at home. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, last summer they took over my front yard. That's okay. We had to wait a year before the goldenrod stowaway found my Bidens, but they did, and now we've got a good population of both of those. So now we've added 4 species to the property. Wanted the hackberry emperor, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs here. It's one of the species that ought to be making a living at our house. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on celtis, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I planted a couple hackberry trees, had to wait 4 years for the butterflies to find my hackberry, but they finally did, and now we've got them as well. So now we've added 6 species, and that's how the restoration proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own, and along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. Goldenrod, in fact, supports 110 species of moths in the mid-Atlantic region. I planted Virginia creeper. I hear sometimes that people don't like Virginia creeper, but I don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It's a good ground cover. You can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. Makes valuable berries for the birds in the fall. And by valuable, I mean they are high in fats. Our migrating birds require high-fat berries because fat contains twice the energy that sugar does. And that's what they need to fuel their migration. And resident birds require high-fat berries because that's what they need to build up their fat stores to get through the winter. And it's a great pollinator plant. The flowers that make these berries are tiny and inconspicuous. You don't even know that Virginia creeper is in bloom until you see this big cloud of native bees around it. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for the large sphinx moths that are a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Wanted to see if I get the evening primrose moth at our house because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, believe it or not, we had no evening primrose, no Enethera, so I planted that. The moth did come, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded in there, but it's always very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, these are just examples of the plant lineages that we put back on our property, but I want to focus on oaks for a while because in most areas of the country, oaks are extremely important. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I do hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to your local food web, and remember, that's one of our goals of landscaping now, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because most of the oaks I planted on our property, I planted as acorns, which means they were free. or 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to call in the moths that make the caterpillars that run the food webs at our house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here is a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. So you don't have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oaks to start to support your local food web. They will do it immediately. Now, this is what our property looks like from the same position I took that original picture. That's where the Bidens took over last summer. Just to show you, we put a lot of plants back. Not all of them. I'm still working on it, but over the last 20 years, my research has shown that if you know the number of moth species in your local food web, you have a very good index of how stable that food web is and how productive that food web is. So 5 years ago, I started the enormous task of taking a picture of every species of moth that is making a living on our property. I am still at it, but I'm up to 1,199 species of moths so far that I've recorded because we put the plants back. Now we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania's 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the landmass, we've got 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these moth species are types of bird food, we have recorded 61 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline that we see all the time. World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. It's a terrible statistic. But I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I am convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. All we did was put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We really could turn things around. But I know what you're thinking. We've got 10 acres. Will it work on smaller plots, let's say in suburbia? And that's a good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri, where they have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of a development. All their neighbors have the big lawns. So they're pretty much an island. And when they moved in, their yard was choked with armor honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, another invasive from Asia. So the first thing they did was get rid of those plants. Then they planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature for the birds. Then they sat back and started to count the birds that are using their yard. And they're up to 149 bird species, including 35 warbler species. Everything about birds, and I think you do, that's an enormous number. Just compare that. We've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on a smaller property? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago, and I mean in Chicago. Right on the other side of this wall is O'Hare Airport. Pam has 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She's not connected to any natural space at all. So she also is an island, a tiny little island. She's a pretty island because Pam is a native plant landscaper and she knows how to do it. But she did the same thing. She got rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, including a water feature. And then she sat back, she says, with a glass of wine and started to count the birds using her yard. But she's up to 124 species of birds that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. All right, there's 3 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. And we do want to succeed in a big way. One of them is we've got to shrink the area we have in lawn. Nationwide, I think the current figure is 44 million acres of lawn. That's an area bigger than New England, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. So why do we do that? Well, it's a status symbol. That's certainly a reason. And we also have to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we cut the area of lawn in half? Excuse me. What if we took, well, let's keep the math simple. Say it's 40 million acres of land, cut it in half, That'll give us 20 million acres we can put towards conservation right in our yards, right at home. And that's so much land we can create a new national park that I'm calling Homegrown National Park. And Homegrown National Park will be huge. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park be the biggest park in the country. What do you get when you put a park at home? What do you get when you put some part of nature right where you live? You get the opportunity to develop a working relationship with nature. All you have to do is go outside. It's your own time, your own pace, or maybe even all you have to do is look out the window. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, there are 375 million people there last year, so I know what you're really going to see. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, not mediated by somebody else. Your relationship with Mother Nature will be unique to meet your own needs. And this is really important for our kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying. We get 30 kids, put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour, and they go to a natural area, and they walk around for an hour. Teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back in the bus, and they go home. And that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and get to know it alone. No parental supervision. They will come home again. When we hover over our kids as parents, we are sending the message that this is dangerous. This is something you need to fear, and I'm going to protect you from it. Our kids are the future stewards of the planet. If they're afraid of being a steward, if they don't love being a steward, they're going to be lousy stewards. We can't afford any more lousy stewardship, folks. And maybe they'll learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest patch of nature's little piece of lawn with a hedge. But she discovered there are anole lizards there. So when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to explain how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards don't see you coming. Then you crawl slowly towards the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress, that's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, you learn how to take care of the lizard, you learn how to be a good steward of it. You fall in love with that piece of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture not long ago, so who knows. But I guarantee she's going to remember these experiences in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the planet because of it. If you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do it. Go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and register your property wherever you live and the amount of area that you're going to be a good steward of. Maybe you really are going to cut the area of lawn you have in half. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. Whatever you do counts. You record that on the website, and then your little piece of your county is going to light up. You get to see other people that have joined in your county. And the object, of course, is to get the entire country to light up. Our biggest problem now is ignorance. What do we have? 320 million people in the country. I would say 319 of them don't have a clue that they are the future of conservation. So we want this message to go viral. What are we asking? We really are asking people to reduce the area in lawn. Lawn's not doing us any good at all. And replace that lawn with important native plants. We want them to remove the invasive plants that are on their property. Most people do have invasive plants, either as ornamentals or edging their property, and they don't even know it. And if you're protecting any natural area, you certainly want to keep doing that. There are important ecological products associated with Homegrown National Park, and one is a significant increase in biodiversity. You can see that just what's happened at our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. Also, a measurable reduction in invasive species. 78% of the country is privately owned. If we all got rid of the invasive species on our property, we'd be 78% done. If we turn lawn into plantings like this, there will be a significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. Lawn is the worst plant choice for sequestering carbon dioxide. Anything else is better. And of course, that helps climate change. And we're also starting to transform the no man's land outside of parks and preserves into viable habitat. That essentially expands the functionality, the size of our parks, so that the creatures that are in those parks will do better over the long run. The sociological products associated with Homegrown National Park are many. One is national awareness, not just that we have a problem, but what the solutions to that problem are. We really are trying to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature is not optional and that everybody owns responsibility to sustaining it. Why? Because everybody requires it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action is even better. And we want to merge existing national conservation efforts. Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, Wild Ones, Sierra Club, they're all doing wonderful things, and most of it's on private property, but it's not being recorded in one single place. So because we don't charge, I forget if I mentioned that, it's free to join Homegrown National Park. We're not pulling members away from any of these groups. We just want to get successful conservation recorded on the map. You know, the 30 by 30 initiative, where we're going to save 30% of the country by 2030. It's not going to happen unless we record conservation on private property. So this is a method to do that. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to join Homegrown National Park. What plants should we put in the areas that once were lawn? I'm going to argue that some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is? It's the stone in the middle of the arch. If you take it out of the arch collapses. Well, it turns out that just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. Those are the keystone plants. So think of the keystone plants as the 2x4s that are holding up the ecological house that you're building in your yard. They're essential. They're the support. You can't build an ecological house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. So the question is no longer simply, are natives ecologically better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are, but there are a lot of native plants that aren't contributing all that much either. So the question really is, do we want to use the most powerful ones, the ones that are contributing the most to our pollinators and to our caterpillars, or not? What is supporting the most caterpillars? Well, I've already mentioned it. It's one of the oaks. 557 species of caterpillars supported in the mid-Atlantic states, over 950 species nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. How do you find out what the keystone species are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of both the woody and herbaceous plants will pop up for your county. These are just representative lists, and it's abbreviated because I ran out of room. Much bigger than that. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light. Which of course is not the goal. There's a lot of research these days, much of it coming out of Europe, demonstrating how light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines. And these are all the ways that lights are killing those insects, particularly the moths that are creating the caterpillars that run our food webs. I see this as good news, folks. We have got to turn around insect decline. We've already lost more than 45% of the insects on the planet. Remember, they are the little things that run the world. And if we can turn that around by flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. There are a lot of switches to flick, but there's a lot of us to switch those flick those switches. I know what you're going to say, though. I can't turn the light out over my barn, over my garage, or over my front porch because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on your light so that it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to realize is the bad man did not come very often. And if you don't want to do that, even easier, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb, yellow incandescent or yellow LED. Yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to nocturnal insects. So they really do reduce insect kills. If we were to switch out our yellow lights, our white lights for yellow lights overnight, we would save millions of insects and millions of dollars too if we used LEDs. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to modify our light system. Then we're going to invite one of the mosquito fogging companies to come kill all of our insects. Booming business around the country. And they say it's okay because what they're fogging is pyrethroids. It's a natural product. And it is a natural product. They're right about that. But I'm not sure that's a good argument. Cyanide is a natural product. Ricin is a natural product. There's a lot of really nasty natural products out there. So saying it's natural doesn't convince me. They also say it only kills mosquitoes. And boy, I wish they were right about that, but they're not even close. It kills all the insects it comes in contact with, which is all the insects, including all those pollinators we're trying to save, including the monarchs. Big monarch kill when they flew through Mosquito Joe 2 years ago, hundreds of dead monarchs on the ground. The interesting thing, the ironic thing, is it does not control mosquitoes. It's almost impossible to control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You have to kill 90% of them to get good control. These mosquito fogging companies can kill between 10 and 50%. So they're not even close to being effective. If you really want to control mosquitoes, you do it with biocontrol using mosquito dunks. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay, put it out in the sun for a couple of days. You're building up the population of algae and diatoms, and that becomes an irresistible brew to any mosquito that wants to lay her eggs. She will lay her eggs in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and you buy a sheet of mosquito dunks, $12. This is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that kills. This formulation only kills aquatic dipteran. The only aquatic dipteran in your bucket is a mosquito larva. So it's really targeted. If a dragonfly gets in here, it's not going to hurt it at all. If your dog drinks it, it's not going to hurt it. You might put a coarse screen over the bucket so the mosquitoes can get in, but the local chipmunk cannot. But again, targeted, cheap, effective, particularly if everybody did it, and you don't have to kill everything else in the process. So let's talk a little bit how you might landscape for hawks. This was one of my charges. How do we develop yards that are going to be good for hawks? Well, hawks have big home ranges. So unless we have really big yards, we're going to have to combine effectively with our neighbors to do this. And you attract hawks by building populations of what they want to eat. So kestrels, we all think they eat mice, and they do. But their primary source of protein really is grasshoppers. So we need to have fields with lots of grasshoppers in them, which means no neonicotinoids, none of these, broad scale, long lasting insecticides that kill insects, from who knows how far away. Neonicotinoids, by the way, are 7,000 times more toxic to insects than DDT was. And it's one of the reasons kestrels are in trouble in so many places. So you want to build grasshopper populations. This is red-tailed hawk. They, of course, want small mammals, the mice and the voles, but the bunnies and things like that. It certainly is possible to do that in a neighborhood. This is red shoulder hawk. That's the most recent species to be nesting at my house. Just build a nest. They like herps. They like frogs and snakes, essentially. We had a nest of red shoulder hawks right in a tree right outside my building at the University of Delaware, right in the middle of Newark, Delaware. They nested for 5 years there, living off the frogs and a little wetland we created just next door. So creating some kind of a wetland in your neighborhood would be essential for those. Then, of course, you got the bird predators. You've got Sharpies and you've got Cooper's hawks, and to sustain them, you need other birds. And everything I've talked about so far, making all those caterpillars, is a great way to make bird populations. As a matter of fact, it is an essential way to make bird populations. So it all ties together in that sense. But again, it takes a fair amount of territory. So this is a great excuse, a great reason to get to know your neighbor. Everybody landscape together with a common goal of supporting these birds. And it would be interesting to hear about a neighborhood that actually said, we're going to do this, and then watch how it develops to see whether it actually works. There's a neighborhood, they could do it, but they're starting from scratch. I mean, this is what a lot of neighborhoods around me look like. That is not the way to build populations of the insects or the birds that eat those insects, or the hawks that eat those birds. Okay, municipalities help us live with nature. They can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota's had a cost-sharing program for several years now that pays homeowners to reduce or actually eliminate their lawn and replace it with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's very popular. And Pennsylvania has a similar program now, which is so popular, there's a big, long waiting list to get on there. I don't know if you heard about this. There's an island off of Florida that is paying residents to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. I think this is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to be a good steward of that species, rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on your invasive ornamentals, things like calorie pear, like burning bush, like barberry. In St. Louis, Missouri, Fayetteville, Arkansas, South Carolina. South Carolina's banned them all together. North Carolina has a bounty on them. If you take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. Many utilities now are giving people $100 coupons to plant water efficient native species. And of course, the big lawn reduction programs in the far west, particularly California. This is going up now. You get $3 per square foot rebate for every square foot of lawn that you replace with a xeric planting. And if you want more information on those different programs, memorize that. All right, I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one is important. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. It's not that we don't like it. We like nature. We like to walk in it or ride our horses or ride our bikes, go bird watching. But we don't think it's essential. And that means when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, nature takes a back seat. Only the essential things get funded. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out. And there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our country's view, our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature, save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy it. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument. We're expanding the national park system. Wonderful places. We want to save them so that future generations can enjoy it. And I get that because nature is enormously entertaining, but it is far more than that. You're missing an important component here. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. A little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. And we talked about that. But if we restrict conservation just to the areas where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those areas these days are too small and too few and too isolated. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. I don't like that language because it suggests they're places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to put the plants back, folks. We need to glue our rug back together again, not just to make biological corridors that allow plants and animals to move between viable habitats, but to recreate viable habitats in all those areas where we've destroyed them. It's early, but this is starting to happen now. And when it does happen, it'll be the first time in modern history where humans really have coexisted with the natural world. A third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, few conservation biologists, few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, because every person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystem. So why wouldn't everybody share the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. Mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We've been very good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good Earth stewardship. That doesn't mean that you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can, you should, you must save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. More and more people are recognizing every day that the Earth has serious problems, but they feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can modify their lights, one person can use keystone plants, one person can put in a pollinator garden. We didn't even talk about that. Remove the invasive plants that are already on their property, fire Mosquito Joe. One person can do a whole bunch of things that will revitalize the little ecosystem on their property and enhance their greater local ecosystem rather than continuing to degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You'll get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a park or a preserve. Help a land conservancy. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So, as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. I think I've convinced my grandkids that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
So I just want to say thank you again to Doug for taking the time to share your expertise with us all. It was very much appreciated. I hope everyone enjoyed as much as I did.
Thanks for the
Um,
opportunity.
of course. So before we all go for the evening, I want to thank you guys all for coming tonight and for your support of Hawkwatch International. This year, we're making more of an effort to bring in speakers like Doug to our virtual lecture series so we can bring you most exciting and up-to-date science. So if you enjoy these programs, we would appreciate you making a gift to allow us to bring in more speakers and compensate them for their work and their time. So I popped in the donation link in our chat. But yeah, with that, I just want to thank you all again and have a good evening. I hope you're inspired to get out in the garden.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.